I'm sure you have all come across references to Acts 17 in one way or another in the whole apologetics literature. So I did that as well, and that started my exploration into this whole area. And it occurred to me that it was really the most quoted passage, I think, in terms of apologetics. But it wasn't necessarily undergirded by serious biblical reflections. So it was often taken for granted what is there. That's always a bit scary, isn't it? And a bit frightening, you know, if you take a biblical passage for granted, because there's a lot to discover there, and there may be some surprises when we move into the area. So I did my PhD on this specific topic. There was no exclamation mark behind it. Otherwise, it's the exact title of the... but I think it will be worth adding an exclamation mark so you think I'm somewhat affirmative in what I'm going to say to you. Anyway, I hope you have all picked up the 3 books, which contains also a wonderful commentary on the book of Acts by David Gooding, called True to the Faith. And the subtitle there is Defining and Defending the Gospel, I think it is. Isn't that interesting? When David Gooding, as a master of the Greek text, both of the Old and the New Testament, is going to summarize the whole message of Acts of the Apostle, the book, he writes, defining and defending the gospel. Which means then that the whole book is a book of apologetics. The whole book is a book of saying, why should someone believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ? And I'm sure you all recall that it's the second volume of a 2-volume work, the first book being the Gospel of Luke. And if you also recall how the first book starts with a preface of 4 verses, and do you remember the purpose of the first book? Why did Luke write the gospel? He talks about that he's investigated those who saw it, the eyewitnesses. He's been exploring that. He's written it all into an orderly account. That's interesting. It's not necessarily a chronological account. It's an orderly account. To what? Remember? Anyone? Yeah.
To show the credibility.
Yes, and then he addresses Theophilos and to show the credibility. So the whole emphasis of the 2-volume book is actually showing the credibility. And when you look at the book of Acts, then, that's the how God continues to work through his apostles. And it's helpful, I think, to look at it at 3 levels in terms of the credibility of the gospel. First of all, it's an account of how the road that the gospel messengers took on their way from Jerusalem to Rome, as it were, and beyond that. And then, secondly, on their way then, they encounter various worldview communities, various faith communities. They encounter Jews, they go into synagogues. They encounter Greeks in Lystra, in Athens, which we will talk about here. They encounter straightforward paganism in a number of places, Ephesus and other places. They also encounter the occult, as you may recall. And they also encounter the question of what is and should the relationship be to the Roman Empire. The whole question of whether it's lawful or not. And I really love, we could have gone into that, but the first part of Act 17, someone claims that they are turning the world upside down because they are saying that another one is Lord. Isn't that a wonderful expression? Think of that, whether that could be said about our ministry, that we are turning the world upside down because we claim that another one is Kyrios, is Lord. That's quite an amazing statement, I find. So then, Act 17, Paul actually entering into what was the cultural center, the intellectual center of ancient times. Highly respected. Really quite small in terms of population, but a very prestigious place. And John Stott, I do recommend his commentary. It's brilliant. He talks about what Paul saw, what Paul felt, what Paul did, and what Paul said. You can't really improve on that, can you? It's such a wonderful summary. What Paul saw, the idolatry. What Paul felt, the deep indignation. God is not given the glory. Then what Paul did, entering the marketplace, and then later on the council of the Areopagus, and then what Paul said in his speech. I think it's helpful, and I think in previous years we've had a good time engaging with the text, and I think it's important to look at it from one perspective. What is the text not? What it's not, and not just what it is. Because there are a number of preconceptions about this text. And I've chosen to highlight four different. Of course I can. Hopefully, without breaking neither this nor your trust. Sorry. First of all, Act 17 is not about Paul's appearance in a legal law court. Some people have taken the story to be a story about a legal defense in a court where Paul then is supposed to be accused and then defends himself. That is not the case. The Areopagus Council was not a legal court. It was a council that had some specific functions. And one of their functions was the following. If someone came into the city and presupposed and to be a herald of a god that wasn't present in the city, a foreign god, then that person would have to appear before this magistrate, this council, the Areopagus Council, and to present their case. For example, should a new altar be built or not? You may recognize some of these themes from Paul's speech. It's a lot about the altar and about Paul then stressing God has been here already. He's created everything. So it's not a legal court defense. It's an invitation as a herald of foreign gods to present his case before this council. That's the first thing we need to clarify. Secondly, in a number of books on missiology, you will find that people claim that this text is a missionary primer. It's a model for how to approach pagan people, non-people without a scripture background. And there is some truth to it, but it's not the whole truth at least. Because Paul's speech from verse 22 onwards is not his first appearance in the city. It's not his first speech in the city. It's actually a follow-up speech. It's a speech of clarification. It's a speech of engaging his interlocutors of various kinds. So we can look at it this way. Paul started in the synagogue, which is just briefly mentioned, then went on into the marketplace. And if you have ever read about the Athenian marketplace, ancient marketplace, it's quite a fascinating place because there a lot of things took place. It was a place for public debate. It was a place for public education. It was a place for leisure, sports. It was a place for, meeting people, probably talking about gossip, which is touched on the passage as well. They don't care about anything but the latest news, gossiping about that. Does that sound familiar to our age? Huh? So there, a lot of things is going on. But Paul is then, first of all, presenting his message in the agora, in the marketplace. And what was his message there? He preached Jesus and the resurrection. First of all, that tells us how central Jesus and the resurrection was. Secondly, if you use the Greek words, it will be Jesus and Anastasia. Jesus is a male noun, Anastasia is a female noun. Aha! Here comes this strange Jew, and seems to be telling about a divine couple, it seems. The male God, Jesus, and the female God, Anastasia, the resurrection. So Paul, again, has to clarify here. I'm sure some of you, or many of you, know the name N.T. Wright, Tom Wright. He seems to be writing his popular books using the name Tom, and all the other books using the name N.T., about the N.T., which is fascinating. Anyway, so N.T. Wright talks about at least one place about Paul in Athens is like a chess master. You have seen the chess master? I think there's actually a Norwegian chess master at the moment. Sorry about that. Or maybe I should be glad about it. He moves around, like you've seen the chess master moving from one table to another, making a draw, and then moving on. You've seen that? I'm sure you've seen it. And that's a perfect picture of Paul going over to the Stoic, then to the Epicurean, then to the popular, the religious pagans, and then to the council and so on. And it's all intermixed. It's a very fascinating thing. There are many things going on at many levels here, because Paul was thoroughly trained in rhetorical technique and approaches. So we'll come back to that a bit later. But the point is, it's not the first speech he delivered in Athens. It's a follow-up speech. It's an apologetic speech where he engages with questions, objections, and worldview alternatives. Thirdly, it's not an isolated text. It's not a text that stands completely on its own, as if this is the place where Paul surrendered to Hellenistic philosophy, and it's really not a very good text to think about. Some people have claimed. But if you look at it carefully, you have a number of parallels. You have a parallel to Acts 14, the Lystra incident. You have a very important parallel to 3 or 4 places in Paul's epistles. Romans 1, about the creation being witness to God's majesty and power. So it's about the witness of God as a creator, not leaving himself without traces. And the 2nd chapter in Romans about the conscience being a witness to God's moral character as well. And then you have a very fascinating passage in 1 Thessalonians 1, where Paul is actually, I think it's verses 9 to 10, Paul is talking about how they came to faith. And this is written just after his visit to Athens, probably. And he talks about turning from idols to the living God to serve him. And if you look at the wording there, it's as if it is an outline of Paul's speech in Athens, really. It's very fascinating. And then, of course, you have the passage in Corinthians about becoming Jew for Jews and Gentiles for Gentiles, about contextualization of the gospel. So it's not an isolated text. It's actually a text that stands in a very rich apologetic tradition from the Old Testament prophets through Jewish Hellenistic prophets in the 2 centuries before, through this passage and the other passages I mentioned, to Justin Martyr, if you've heard of him from the early church, which really uses Paul's approach in his dialogue and polemics over against the pagan religion. Fourthly, it's not a mistake. This is something which appears in a number of more evangelical interpretations of the text. People feel uncomfortable about the philosophy. People feel uncomfortable about it. Looks like as if Paul is becoming rationalistic, some people feel. But then we should not just think about what I've said already about the connections to various scripture passages, but also explore how the passage fit into the overall pattern of Acts, the book of Acts. There is, for example, exactly the same structure in verses 32 to 34. Some sneered, rejected, others wanted to know more. Hoi men, hoi de in Greek. It's the same as in so many other places. Some rejected, some believed. Some didn't want to hear anything about this. Others wanted to pursue this further. So it's a very deep realism throughout the book of Acts about how it is. And some people say, well, there weren't that many that came to faith, was it? When did the number of converts decide about the content of anything? Can it be that sometimes it was so hard in a context that just sowing the seed is so demanding? So we must never, judge the authenticity of a message by the number of converts or the number appearing to anything. That becomes too simplistic and simply dangerous in many places. So this is a deeply biblically rooted passage in the Old Testament prophets. But Paul is a marvelous communicator, contextualizing. So these are 4 of the approaches that are unhelpful when approaching the passage. So maybe now it's appropriate to read the passage in chapter 17 from verse 16. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. And the word greatly distressed, it's the same word as it's used in the Greek Old Testament for God's anger towards idolatry. It's a very strong word. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, the agora, day by day, with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. Some of them asked, "What is the babbler trying to say?" And the word babbler there is like the word for a bird that picks up little seeds. I know it's a figurative speech about this one is really not someone you have to take seriously. It's someone who is just a babbler. Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. Well, it's almost true, isn't it? He advocated a foreign God, but not foreign gods. Why did they say that? They said this because, as I said, Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus. Let me explain. Areopagus, it's Ares is the name of the Greek name of the god of war. In Latin, it's used Mars. Therefore, you will meet Mars Hill, expression in many translations. And that council had given name, or had got its name rather, from the hill called the Ares Hill, the Mars Hill. So in this context, the council met both, sometimes at the hill, but more often in the marketplace. So I'm convinced the whole scene is in the marketplace. It's not up there. Therefore, it should never be translated, it went up, but it went before. Okay, that's a little parenthesis. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we want to know what they mean." And then there is this little narrative aside. All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. This wonderful irony from Luke here, They prided themselves for being so intellectually superior. But what did they do? They were following the latest fashion, the latest ideas. It's really quite ironic. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. The word religious has a double meaning here. It's a double entendre in a way. It's both affirmative. It's good that you're religious. But it's also, the meaning of it is also you are superstitious. So you choose which meaning did Paul have. Maybe he had both. So it's an affirming and challenging at the same time. For as I walked around and observed your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. Now what you worship as something unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you. Okay, here is Paul looking around, and suddenly, Heureka, I found it. I found an altar to an unknown God. Have you ever reflected on that? The altar has a number of functions there. The first function is that it refers to the fact that according to Athenian popular folk stories or folk tales, the popular stories about their origin, 500, 600, 700 before Christ, they actually were hit by a very serious disease. And there they wanted, what have we done? This must be the judgment of the gods. So then they placed offerings to all the gods. But then it occurred to them, how do we know that we have offered to all gods? There may be someone we have forgotten. Okay, we have to build an altar to an unknown God. That's really a safety guarantee, isn't it? Insurance. So a kind of divine insurance policy from them, Well, we need to safeguard. We mustn't forget anyone. So therefore they built this. So therefore immediately, for the Athenians, they would have thought about the judgment when Paul introduced this. That's one element. And as you know, probably remember, Paul comes back to the word, to the judgment as a very important theme towards the end. But there is also another dimension. If the unknown God is a real God, do you follow me? If the unknown God is a real God, what about the others? What about all the other gods, all the other altars, all the other? They must be idols. And this is actually the perspective of Justin, for example, when he encounters and uses this passage. He talks about that the altar to an unknown God is an implicit critique of all the other gods, because the other altars claim knowledge about God. This claims ignorance about God, which is a very honest thing, and there's a longing here for, tell us more about this unknown God. And Paul actually says, now what you worship as something unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you. That's a wonderful statement, isn't it? About Paul finding that specific point of contact in the whole Athenian context, which he's able to build bridges to, and it's like a bridgehead. But as I said, it functions as an implicit critique of all the others as idolatry. And then comes the speech. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. Here is God as the transcendent God, the God, beyond everything. But it's also God as the immanent God, God being close, giving life and breath to everyone. And here is the chess player, affirming the Stoics' view of God or the gods as distant. There's some truth in that. And then in the next sentence, affirming the Stoics' view of God as some the immanent logos, the immanent cosmological principle, as it were. There is some truth in that. God is present, he is within, but he's also without. Very powerful. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the times and set for them and the exact places where they should live. Okay, So this unknown God that has created everything and is also close, he knew the Athenians. So the unknown non-God is not, the Athenians are not unknown to him. It's a wonderful way of introducing God as someone who really is present. You remember John Lennox this morning about Hagar? About God being concerned about Hagar. One thing is Hagar's role in salvation history. Another thing is God really being concerned about Hagar physically, as John said, and spiritually. It's about the same thinking here, the same kind of affirmation. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. So Paul is saying here, we are groping around in darkness. We cannot find God, though we search for him. But God is looking for us. So the direction is God's. God's grace, we heard this morning. God has the initiative. He is the one who takes the initiative. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. So it's not just the temple that, the altar, to the unknown God that affirms this, but even their own poets. There are at least some elements of truth in what they are saying. They are affirming their dependence on something more than themselves. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, if we come from God, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. So if we are, as we would use, made in the image of God, God is not lesser than a human. He is not below a human. He is larger, bigger. Just to make a little pause here, when people talk about evil and suffering, for example, people often imply that God's standards is really below us. Whereas it's the opposite. God's standard is beyond us. It's above us. In the past, God, being like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. And you may recall Isaiah 40 to 45, Jeremiah, many of the prophets, it's exactly their critique of idolatry. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance. So God has shown grace, overlooking it. But now, he commands all people everywhere to repent. And what is the evidence for that? For he has set a day when he will judge the world. Again, judgment as a theme. With justice. God is to be trusted. God is the one who is not below our standards, but above our standards. He will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. The man he has appointed. Going back to the foreign gods question, who was Jesus? Well, he was a man. He was more than a man, of course, but he was a man. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. It's a very strong word about the resurrection being the evidence of God interacting in history. And then comes the epilogue. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, which of course was a controversial subject both for the Stoics and the Epicureans and the others. Some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. A few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them were Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. As you can see, there's a lot going on here. And I would like to summarize it, because we are looking at from the point of view of apologetics. To summarize it as a 5-part structure. And I've touched on all these already. Paul is actually He's identifying and affirming points of contact. The altar being a very important point of contact, of course, but also the poets, for example. So, thinking about the model here, as an apologetic model within the structure of, we talked about the structure of the book of Acts and the book of Luke as the 2 volumes, being concerned about the credibility of the Christian faith. We need always to remember that we need to identify and affirm points of contact. And then the question, of course, comes to us. What are the most essential points of contact in our culture? And then Paul moves from that into a 3-part argument. The longest argument, the most developed argument in Luke's summary here, is the natural theology argument. And to paraphrase, one could say it in the following way. Every worldview is, in a way, a natural theology. It tries to explain the world, try to explain, the cosmos, the universe, and humanity, purpose, meaning, truth, and so on. So here is Paul showing that the other worldviews that were present, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and so on, they did not have the same credibility when it comes to explaining the universe, when it comes to explaining who we are as humans. It's only the Judeo-Christian God who has the credibility to explain in his person and in his deeds, through his actions, the universe and humanity. So it's about God as creator, God as the author of life, the author of cosmos, the whole of life, and the author of humanity made in the image of God. And then Paul moves on to the second stage in his argument, and I find that very fascinating because, and we can paraphrase this in the following way. Paul's point being, if God is the author of life, he has the authority over life. If God is the author of life, he has the authority over life. We are all familiar with, copyright issues in our culture. And this is really the basic idea here, that the copyright belongs to God, the one who created all, who sustains it all, who is the one who sent Jesus, which Paul comes back to. So it's the author of life has authority over life. The ultimate authority belongs to one and only, to God, the one and only God. And this, of course, relates to God's judgment, and then by implication to God's holiness, by implication to God's moral character. And there's a very important link between God as creator and sustainer and God as judge, as the one who has ultimate authority. And the third stage in Paul's argument is moving forward saying, well, the God who has now, in Paul's argument, being shown to be the one who explains the world and humanity much better than any other worldview. And by implication, if he does that, if he really is the God of the universe and God of humanity, the one and only God, he has authority over life. But is this God still unknown? No. He has shown his face. He has shown his name in Jesus Christ, the man whom God has appointed. And I think there is something very significant about highlighting the resurrection in such a clear way there. Because that means both that, the resurrection deals with death. Death is really the most ultimate challenge for us as human beings, encountering death. It's the ultimate border, the ultimate limit of our control. So actually, God is acting not in any distant area from where we really have our ultimate need, but at the very point that where our need becomes most obvious, when we face death. That's the point where God meets us. So the whole question about the resurrection of Jesus highlights the importance of the relevance of that to the most ultimate questions in life, basically, fundamentally, facing death. And if we link that to, what Romans and 1 Corinthians talks about, the wages of death, the wages of sin being death, then it becomes, even more important. So first of all, why is the resurrection an indicator of a pointer towards truth here? Because first of all, it pinpoints the basic fundamental dilemma of our existence. We are moving towards death. Secondly, it highlights the uniqueness of Jesus. No one else has conquered death. He is the one and only Lord of life. So it's something fundamentally being said about Jesus. And of course, the Greeks had their ideas about death and the afterlife. And this was very challenging, as we can see to the reaction we read about. Some sneered, this was too much for them. But some really thought maybe this is something worth exploring. And in our culture as well, I think, death. How do we tackle death? How do we treat death? That's a very critical issue, I think, in our cultures today. So we may come back to that in our discussion. So why is the resurrection highlighted? Because it's an ultimate question for us, death. Secondly, it really is indicating, showing, being evidence of who Jesus is. And thirdly, it's open for investigation. So it's not a blind faith, again going back to John this morning. Faith is not blind, it's the opposite. It's faith based on evidence. And with all this then, Paul moves to points of tension, which is implicit in it all, implicit in the three-part argument. Really, the God or the idols. Who has authority, ultimately? And who is the Lord of life, ultimately? Are we, or is it God? Before opening up for discussion, may I just mention one thing? That I think it's very helpful when you look at different expositions of this passage, that some expositors only emphasize points of contact. Others only emphasize points of tension. I could give you an endless list of names. I won't bore you with that. But it's the secret to this passage is Paul, the master chess player, doing both, affirming, challenging.